Let me welcome you tonight to the Forum of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and especially welcome John Sununu, White House Chief of Staff and former three-term governor of New Hampshire. The post of Chief of Staff provides what is probably the optimal perch from which to sum up the mythic period known since FDR's administration as the first 100 days. Always a hectic but exciting time in any new administration. Add to this Mr. Sununu's experience as a governor, as a state representative, not to mention that he serves on an advisory board here at the Kennedy School, and I think you'll agree that he has a unique perspective on the events of this period. We're therefore especially privileged and pleased to welcome Mr. Sununu here tonight, and glad that he was able to make time in his schedule to be with us. To introduce the governor and to field the questions after, let me give you Shirley Williams, who's the acting director of our Institute of Politics. Shirley.
Governor Sununu, ladies and gentlemen, I think that Graham and I had two great ambitions for the end of this semester. One was to persuade Governor Sununu, now Chief of Staff at the White House, to visit the boutique on the Charles, which is famous for having provided so many distinguished Republicans in recent Republican administrations. We thought he should see where his trouble came from, and we were only too delighted to welcome him, not only in his role as Chief of Staff, but also, of course, as a distinguished professor at our neighbouring University of Tufts, where he was, for some years, Professor of Mechanical Engineering. I was also told in the course of doing some research into Governor Sununu, which among other things took me up to Dartmouth College to investigate on the spot, that according to a great friend of the school, Nancy Bush Ellis, Mr. Sununu is famous for being hysterically funny. I'm waiting to see the jokes he's going to crack to us, but I have to tell him that at the end of my researches, I discovered two things, which you may or may not regard as funny. One was that at one time he was scientific advisor to a governor of New Hampshire, Governor Thompson, who rather unexpectedly thought that it would be appropriate for the National Guard to have nuclear weapons. I'm pleased to say that Mr. Sununu appears to have discouraged that rather strongly. And secondly, I learnt in New Hampshire that no one was more famous for running his own ship and rowing his own boat than Governor Sununu. He now has many ships and many paddles to organise, and we're all looking forward very much to hearing how he does it, because we understand he does it very well. Governor Sununu.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here tonight. It is always nice to, as heretical as it may sound, get out of the Beltway and back out in America, where beyond the Beltway, where most of the real political wisdom resides. I still get abused for retaining that point of view, but so far I've been able to preserve the purity of that perspective. I think it is, in fact, the reality of that perspective that has President Bush sitting in the White House today. If you evaluated what was happening in the last election on the basis of the Beltway press, you would have been surprised in November. If you evaluated it in terms of talking to the people of America, you would have understood what happened in November. I am here today with with an assignment that almost parallels that point of view. I would like to talk a little bit about what I think has really happened since January 20th, 1989, and talk about it in the context of the beginning of a long-term agenda. It has become traditional in commentary about a new administration to focus on that 100-day period as if everything had to be done then. And the fact is that the most important thing about a 100-day period, in my opinion, is that you set the foundation for the succeeding days of the administration. And we have looked at it as the first quarter out of not only 16 quarters in the 4 years of the first term, but first quarter out of 32 quarters. And with that in mind, let me talk a little bit about what I think has happened. First of all, President Bush has brought a style to the White House that is significantly different from most of his predecessors. Style ought not to be perceived as being better or worse. It ought to be understood merely as being different. The reason I emphasize that is I think a great deal of difficulty in analyzing what has happened sometimes comes from those who try and fit either the daily activities or the White House structure or the specific personnel that may be brought in into the old-time model they may have in mind, the style of previous occupants of the White House, or needs which may have been more appropriate in preceding administrations as having been focused on then and perhaps not being focused on now. George Bush, as President of the United States, brings to the White House a style which is a bit unique. It is not unusual for the President to pick up the phone and call one of the staff members with a very specific question that he cares about at the moment. We have to have a staff that can respond to that kind of a style. It is a president that likes to be, he is a president that likes to be involved in the details at various levels of the development of policy, and yet he is a president that has an uncanny timing in terms of when he wants things done and a self-discipline that allows that timing to govern. Again, let me go back to the campaign, those days in late spring, early summer, when the press and commentators were suggesting that the campaign was too late in starting, that it wasn't focusing on the issues the way it should. It wasn't talking about the issues the way America wanted them to be talked about at the time the commentators thought it ought to be talked about. I suggest to you that the most important thing about the 1988 campaign was the sense of timing and discipline in deciding when and where to begin focusing on issues and the kind of emphasis to give to those issues. And there is a parallel there. I think the most important thing that has taken place since January 20th has been that timing, that discipline on timing as displayed by the President, and the unwillingness to merely come forth with proposals, initiatives, too early, unwilling to be either too early or there just for the headlines. And this is a president that has a sense of understanding that foundations have to be built, relationships have to be established, working styles have to become part and parcel of the daily activities, and we have to do things in a way that builds forward rather than takes a grand leap that captures headlines and finds that there is no foundation to stand on after the initial splurge has taken place. One of the most interesting things that I have ever seen in public life occurred about 6 or 8 weeks ago when the vogue of the week and most news cycles in terms of persistence of reporting over a number of days last for about a week or 10 days in Washington. And there was this period in which we were being criticized for not manipulating the press. That followed a period of 8 years in which the press felt they had been manipulated and criticized that. Now, I don't think the reporting about not manipulating the press and being criticized for that was the most interesting thing. What was interesting was the week that followed that, in which the new consensus is that the style we had adopted of not manipulating the press was in itself the ultimate manipulation. And I have pointed out that at least on one count they were right, but I refuse to tell you which of those two perspectives was correct. Let me talk about some of the specifics that have taken place. Some of the very substantial initiatives may not be very sexy, may not have grabbed headlines, but I believe they reflect the determination of this president to deal with the tough issues in a way that solves them rather than merely exploits the public relations side. First piece of legislation the President instructed had to be prepared and sent forward was a piece of legislation dealing with a savings and loan problem. This is a problem that has persisted in this country for a couple of decades. It has gotten worse, and at every turn, when it got bad enough to begin to catch attention, a Band-Aid solution was put forward. The President made a very simple request. He said, get a package together that deals with this problem in terms of what it needs today, and in terms of what it needs tomorrow, and in terms of what it needs as a permanent fix. And the package was put forward that dealt with the financial side, and the regulatory side, and the administrative side. It was sent up within about 10 days of inauguration. The President asked that Congress act on it quickly, and although there's been a little bit of foot dragging lately, it looks like within a few weeks that legislation will come forward and deal with a financial problem that was serious to the tune of being the largest financial problem this country has ever had, and being a problem that had the capacity of undermining completely the fiscal stability of the system that has been a very important part of economic success in this country. It was brought forward, it was worked in Congress, and it will come out probably about the way it was sent in and reflect a major, major achievement. Second issue the President directed, of that nature that the President directed something be done, is he asked Secretary Brady, Secretary of Treasury, to begin to address, and I say begin because a solution to this problem cannot be put together in a short period of time, but to begin to address the issue of third world debt, to come up with a structure that doesn't spiral the debt upward, but begins to spiral it downward. Virtually all solutions in the past ended up with the debtor nations owing more and more and more, to a point where the stability of their own economies not only was threatened, but became so intertwined with the provider, the lender countries, that it was an international issue of tremendous scope. Secretary Brady did come up with a plan that has that characteristic of spiraling the debt down, took advantage of some of the resources that are there for a variety of uses, but the most important thing is that that plan is now beginning to be accepted as a framework under which both the lender nations and the debtor nations can work, and I think you will see continued commitment to it in the months ahead. Again, a problem of long standing, a problem of significant size, and a problem of great complexity, the kind of a problem that most political figures would suggest somebody find a way to tuck under the rug, and yet the President insisted in that very critical early period that it be brought forward as one of the first things to be done. The budget was then presented. February 9th speech was made, a budget that for a long time people suggested could not be presented and delivered consistent with his commitment not to increase taxes, not to bring forth new taxes. Not only did that budget framework go in without new taxes, it went in with initiatives in education, with about $1 billion of expansion in dealing with the problem of drugs, with about $6 billion allocated towards that. It went in with a program focusing on the accountability side of education, and an emphasis, recognition, that if we are to deal with the educational problem in this country, we have to have a framework that understands that local control, state funding, state control are the heart and soul of that system, that the federal government ought to have programs which don't interfere but which complement that structure and provide incentives to performance by students, incentive to performance by teachers, and by good school districts, and that focus was there. It was a package that included within it an initiative on child care, again with some very strong commitments to basic principles. In this particular case, commitments to the fact that the parents should be able to choose where a child is taken care of. That some of the traditional ways of doing that, church-based services or family-based services, ought not to be excluded from that process, and that the primary focus of the resources be to assist the family and the children, and not merely to fund a new provider service or provider bureaucracy. That bill is up on the Hill, and although there are now 3 or 4 versions based on similar principles as the President's bill, it appears that that too can be worked out, and that those initiatives will be funded within the budget package as presented. There are some other pieces of that budget that are important, pieces which will encourage investment for job creation and re-stimulate some of the basic strengths of this country, the science and technology base, which for a long time has been neglected. Those 2 aspects include the reduction of the rate of tax on capital gains and the incentives for R&D investment, and other components based on encouraging the strengthening of our system rather than the erosion which seems to have been the trend for the last decade or 2. There's a recognition that in a competitive world you have to have a tax structure that does not penalize investment, and a tax structure particularly that addresses the cost of capital in a way that allows that cost to come down to the levels of our major competitors, in particularly Japan. That was built into the budget, and that budget was sent up. Again, it was expected to not be received well. Not only has it been received well, but that budget resolution has been adopted by both House and Senate in the Conference Committee, and is the resolution under which the appropriations will now take place. It is a budget which fulfills not only campaign commitments in general, but the very specific one of not requiring new taxes. It took place in a climate where the President was assumed to have come out of a tough campaign, and the argument was that campaign was so tough that there is no way he is going to be able to get the cooperation of a Congress controlled by the Democrat Party. That achievement on the budget, I think, reflects a very significant change in both the reality and perception associated with the level of cooperation that has been achieved. There are some other areas that are obviously important in which major initiatives have been undertaken and successfully completed. One of the most divisive foreign policy issues of the last few years has been a divided perspective between the executive branch and the legislative branch on how to deal with efforts to spread democracy in Central America. Again, the President recognized the fundamental principle that in order to, for example, provide the pressure on Nicaragua to move to elections, the resistance was in opposition to the Sandinistas had to be kept together. And so he recognized that the principal goal was to get the resources to keep that resistance together. And through a series of tough, principled, but focused negotiations, the administration was able, with primarily the lead taken by Jim Baker, to get Congress to agree to a package that provides those funds and puts the pressure on Nicaragua to move to elections in February of next year. Now, not only was that package important from the specific point of view of moving to elections in Managua, but when the problem now came forward in Panama, the most important thing that came out of that was that for the first time we were able to put pressure on the dictatorship in Panama, not as a single country, but with virtually the unanimous support of all the Latin American and South American democracies. And the vote in the OAS the other day is a reflection, again, of a very significant change, a sea change in terms of that support. Only Panama and Nicaragua voting against the resolution. And there have been very significant statements, strong statements, made by elected leaders in this hemisphere against the dictatorship of Noriega in Panama, urging him to leave. That is very, very different from the dealings in Central and South America over the past few years. And that, again, is a reflection of dealing with a fundamental need first and building on that change that occurs when the fundamental need is taken care of. And without a doubt, this reunification in terms of policy of Western democracies is one of the most significant things that has taken place in the first 3 months here. The President has addressed his responsibilities with alliance members in Europe, and certainly the headlines of the last few weeks have focused on not similarities, but perhaps some of the differences. The fact is that there is a strong understanding by all the alliance members that what they are celebrating this year in Brussels as they come together as NATO for the 40th birthday, 40th anniversary of NATO, is the success of NATO and its values, its commitment to democracy, and its understanding of principles of economics that are very different than the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc states. And in a sense, what will be celebrated there is the success of the principles that have been led by this country, by the United States, in the post-war era. You look in the Soviet Union, in the Eastern Bloc states, you will see a set of political systems based on communism that are crumbling. You will see economic systems that are in shambles. And you will see a change, a real change, beginning to take place. A change reflective and, in fact, mimicking the basic principles of the West. It would not have been easy to predict a year ago or so that there would have been elections this year in the Soviet Union. It would not have been easy to predict that the economic forces of the market, of free markets, would begin to be felt in the Soviet Union, where the bulk, over 50% of their farm produce, is now coming from farms that have some component of ownership in them rather than the socialist communist structure. That is beginning to have an impact there. There are other places in the world where similar changes are taking place. Certainly in China, the economic system that they have put together in recent years is much more reflective of Western structure than it is of the basic communist system. And the pressures that have arisen internally from a yearning to a economic structure that is far different from what the communist structure of that country 10, 20, and 30 years ago had envisioned. And a clamor in that country for democracy, producing the kind of transition we now see taking place there, is reflective of the kind of success that the President recognizes creates opportunities. But opportunities that are there have to be dealt with in a very measured way. And opportunities in a period of change, in a period of instability, are opportunities that have to be dealt with in a very delicate way. One of the most amazing things that took place in our visit to China, for example, was listening to Deng Xiaoping go on about a 40-minute dissertation of the relationship between China and the Soviet Union and the rest of their Pacific Basin partners. At the end, Deng Xiaoping had a sentence which, depending on how it's interpreted, was the following: "We are committed to democracy." And I assure you that the whole purpose of his presentation and the inclusion of that sentence at the end was his communication to a president that he had come to know over the years. The whole purpose of what he wanted to communicate then was an urging that we understand that changes are taking place, would be taking place there, and the kinds of slogans you hear chanted on television in recent days are reflective not only of the fact that there is a yearning amongst the masses there, but there is a sensitivity, whatever sensitivity might produce in terms of response, I can't tell you, but at least an awareness, a sensitivity and awareness on the part of the leaders of that country that that is the pressure they are facing. I'm not suggesting that the changes that have taken place in China and the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc countries, are the result of what has taken place in the last 3 or 4 months in Washington. But I am suggesting that what has taken place in the last 3 or 4 months in Washington is a recognition that those trends are taking place, and a recognition that in order to deal with them, we cannot merely throw out slogans or initiatives or suggestions without being very, very careful on the impact they have not only on those that have not traditionally been our friends. We have to go through the consultation process with our friends so that we can ourselves assimilate the kinds of changes we are proposing. That brings me to the cycle of the last few days in which Mr. Gorbachev has made some suggestions that have certainly captured headlines. And the response here has been to suggest that perhaps we have not reciprocated with grand gestures to match. Again, I go back to the fundamental premise that I started with, that here is a president that understands that pace is important, that timing is important, and that substance is critical. Mr. Gorbachev is coming out of a system in which their basic political process and their basic economic process is crumbling. Without a doubt, he is trying to pull it back together with some grand public relations efforts. And he is clever enough, wise enough, to take advantage of some of the numerical imbalances that exist, for example, in the area of arms control. And yet the fact is if we are to make changes that are significant in terms of movement towards tranquility and peace, the level of interaction has to be such that the kinds of changes that have to take place are movements towards parity, much more significant in terms of what the Soviet Union will have to do, and much more balanced in terms of changes across the board. I'm not suggesting that what Mr. Gorbachev has put forward does not deserve a response. On the contrary, I am suggesting that what he has put forward deserves a proper response, a response based on consultation with allies, and a response that is framed to produce more movement, significant movement, but movement towards a more stable, more tranquil environment in terms of arms and in terms of relationships amongst allies and relationships amongst the Soviet Union and its allies. At a time when the problems we are looking at have been created over a period of decades, I do not think it is unreasonable for a response, and the time for response, to be measured over a period of weeks. And I suggest that the trip to NATO and the subsequent economic summit that will take place in Paris over the next 2 months will be both opportunities and opportunities taken for encouraging the kind of relationships that I'm sure everyone in this room recognizes can and should take place in 1989. Let me just add a couple of more things, and I will open it up to questions. There are other areas that are crucial, areas in which initial steps have been taken. For example, in the Mideast, a system of discussions had been stalemated, and I believe the President, with his invitations and meetings with the leaders of Jordan and Israel and Egypt, has reinitiated the process. There has been some movement. There has been some significant change, particularly with the action taken at the last month or so of the Reagan administration. And one can only hope that as the Arab nations gather next week in Morocco, that there will be some additional movement, a reflection of a dialogue that for a long time had been a pair of monologues. Perhaps a dialogue has been established amongst the parties there with the initiation of some of the efforts that took place in the meetings that were in Washington, and in addition to that, some of the communications that have taken place since. There is no question that the Mideast remains one of the volatile spots in foreign policy in this world, and there is no question that it remains one of the most complex, intractable problems, and there again is probably no question that its solution is in the hands of the participants even more than in the hands of the superpowers. And yet there is a role for the United States, and perhaps even a role for the Soviet Union eventually, to provide the encouragement that is necessary for parties to talk and to continue talking and to deal with the tough part of the issues that for so long have been swept aside. I think that you will see this approach designed to deal with real problems in a tempered way, in a measured way, and to build on solutions in a very disciplined way, will in the long run produce significant results. I suspect that this administration will go through a period of time in which the impatience of those who like to review and criticize will continue. But the nicest part of my job, I must tell you, I've been working for a president who every morning is able to take a look at that criticism and understand that he himself has a better sense of what is going on, a sense of what has to be done, and a sense of the timing that is so crucial in getting results. I've been asked whether it's been different being in Washington as Chief of Staff than it was as Governor, and obviously the answer is yes. The surprising thing for me is that it has been so much fun, and part of that has been working for somebody that I understand, somebody that I respect, and somebody who every day confounds all of us with the fact that he, for example, in dealing with the leaders of the world, not only knows them, but knows their children, their cousins, where they go to school, and is always making inquiries that astounds even those that he's communicating with. It is going to be a very important administration, and it is an administration that I suspect, if I get a chance to come back in a year or two, we will be reviewing the very significant substance of the achievements that have taken place. I thank you for the chance to come here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Do you want to field the questions, or you want me to field them?
Thank you, Governor, for a very comprehensive speech, and I hope you will consider yourself invited already for a year's time and then again for 2 years' time. Can we ask the first questioner? Yes, sir. Please.
Mr. Sununu, you've discussed the measured and studied approach that the administration is taking toward foreign policy implementation, specifically in our relations with the Soviet Union. And essentially, I agree with you, but I wonder if you'd comment further on perhaps the advantages or disadvantages to this approach, and whether it places us at a slight disadvantage to react if, in fact, the Soviet Union should propose a real innovation in this particular area, for example, in arms control.
You're never at a disadvantage if you are not. Let me back off a minute. The concern, obviously, if I understand your question correctly, is that Mr. Gorbachev may make a proposal which will capture the imagination of people around the world and be an irresistible proposal. There are two possibilities. It is irresistible and good, or it is irresistible and no good. If it is irresistible and good, then it's a very easy thing to participate in and to move forward on. If the result you get is constructive, all the better. Perhaps, though, it will be, as has been most of what you have seen from Mr. Gorbachev, irresistible and no good. Then you have to bring forward your own set of proposals that make some sense and argue why your proposal makes more sense than the other. Let me give you an example on the basis of what has happened in the last few weeks coming from the Soviet Union. Mr. Gorbachev has talked about a reduction of a total, I believe, of 500, the equivalent of 500 weapons, nuclear weapons, in Europe. That's wonderful in terms of headlines. In terms of substance, it includes a little over 100 of the short-range missiles that they might have. The equation on short-range missiles, depending on exactly how you count the Soviet Union's missiles, is somewhere between 88 Western missiles and between 12 and 1,500 Soviet missiles. You can throw around 500, you can throw around 1,000. All they're trying to do is create an incentive for us to remove 88, which they're very concerned about. If they're very concerned about 88, I suspect we should be appropriately concerned about 1,200 to 1,500. The right level of negotiation is not just to throw numbers out, but to recognize that the reason the 88 are there are to complement the smaller number of ground forces we have, the smaller number of tanks that we have, and the smaller level of artillery that we have. I think if you are going to move forward on arms control in Europe, you really must begin to deal with the conventional forces first. That has been our position, and I think if we stick with it, we will find that temptation so strong that maybe Mr. Gorbachev will come along with something that is irresistible and good.
Next question on this side.
Mr. Sununu, many people in the first 3 months of the administration have commented on the good relations between Capitol Hill and the White House. But yesterday, Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell said about President Bush's last recent administration that he has been a complete failure on the environment, he has shown a disdain for the working poor, and he is fumbling in his relations with the Soviets. Will you please comment on Senator Mitchell's remarks and also on this seeming evaporation of conciliatory atmosphere between the White House and Capitol Hill?
Well, it's a shame that I haven't seen the details of that report. I will assume they're correct, but I hope that Senator Mitchell will come back to the fold and be part of being part of the problem, the solution of the problem, and not part of the problem. It is my suggestion, for example, when he says the president hasn't been respectful of the poor, that what he is talking about is the budget agreement that Senator Mitchell was a principal signer of. And therefore, one would, I don't think I'm going out too far suggesting that, that when one criticizes what one is a party to, then one ought to be called a hypocrite. And with all due respect to the majority leader, I hope your report is wrong, but if it is correct, I find this president is kind enough and gentle enough to probably forgive him even that transgression.
Mr. Sununu, I'd like to ask you a question that draws on your personal experience. One analogy that is frequently heard, particularly during election time, is that which draws comparisons between the two highest offices in state and federal government, the governorship and the presidency. You've served as governor of New Hampshire, and now you serve, or have served over 100 days, as the president's right-hand man. From your experience and from your new vantage point, what do you perceive to be the greatest differences in the requirements of governance, of leadership, as executed by the president and the governor?
Well, there are some similarities and there are some differences. The most obvious differences are in terms of the experience. I think the greatest asset that this president brings to the job is his experience in foreign policy, and it does not come from being a governor. There are times, perhaps, when that blend is not necessary, but I think at these times it's a very important asset for the president that sits in the White House today to have, and George Bush has it. There are other assets that are probably common to both positions. One is an ability to delegate, and contrary to legend, I think one of the requirements of delegating well is a willingness to get involved in details. And that may sound paradoxical, but I don't think you can delegate properly without knowing what you're delegating. And I think one of the great assets governors have that do well, and presidents ought to have, is a blend of willing to be involved at appropriate levels of detail, willing to delegate, and then able to deal with what comes back. I think the second thing you have to do is have a sense of timing, and it is what I think is one of the great strengths of this president, because decisions can be made too quickly, and decisions can be made too slowly. And the sense of exactly when you come forward with something is really a tremendous advantage. It is hard sometimes not to jump on bandwagons, and you will see fads of legislation pass through state capitals across this country. And it might be interesting sometimes to watch as states jump on the bandwagon or don't jump on the bandwagon, and then analyze whether those governors that did or didn't were either too late or too soon. And I think at the federal level this is also important. There are waves of popularity for issues that come forward, And you can take a position too quickly, cast your feet in concrete too firmly, and find out that you can't move towards the better position having done that. And I think that sense of timing is probably an asset that both governors and presidents have to have. And finally, I think one asset that too few in both jobs have is a willingness not to take themselves too seriously. You have to take the job seriously and the responsibilities seriously, but once you start taking yourself too seriously, everything else begins to erode. And I think those are the three most important assets I can identify.
Governor Sununu, we seem to have peace and prosperity, which were two of Dwight Eisenhower's goals. I think you deserve a lot of credit for a very articulate, informative presentation. We still have some foreign policy problems and issues. I'd like to know how you think George Bush may approach the problem of the preservation of the tropical forests, and how he may deal with certain dictators like Khomeini, Assad, Noriega. How are they making George Bush a wimp? Are we facing the loss of life in Lebanon and issues like that?
The last guy that thought that was going to happen is still in Boston. Let me talk a little bit about the problem of the tropical forests. Global warming is an issue. It's a very significant issue. There are some numbers associated with it that at least we ought to have a sense of as we frame it. About half of the problem of global warming is caused by the generation of carbon dioxide, actually about 55 or 60% if I remember the numbers right. A great deal of the problem is caused by other chemicals that are emitted to the atmosphere, the fluorocarbons in particular. They cause, I think, about 25%. And a good chunk, about 10 to 15%, I believe, is caused by deforestation. The world, in concert, has taken some very significant steps in terms of the emissions of fluorocarbons. That was a relatively easy one to do. It required spending a little bit more money, perhaps, and applications of a little better technology. The issue of deforestation is a very hard one. President and Jim Baker raised that, for example, with the president of Brazil in a bilateral meeting in Tokyo at the funeral when the president went through about 21 bilaterals. And the response of Brazil was not unlike the response you will probably get from a number of countries in which major deforestation is taking place. When the suggestion was made that the third world debt issue might be coupled to the restoration of forests, they felt that we were trying to intrude on their sovereignty. And so there is one where even the available of financial leverage may not contribute to a solution unless it's handled very, very carefully with the kind of respect for sovereignty that will encourage cooperation, with the kind of sharing of responsibility that doesn't sound like it's the northern hemisphere pointing fingers at the southern hemisphere, and with the kind of cooperation that helps a recultivation of that precious asset. That effort is underway at a variety of levels. The third area, the CO2, is going to cause a great deal of schizophrenia in how it's going to be dealt with. Because frankly, CO2 comes from burning coal, oil, natural gas, wood, any combustion. And it can't be scrubbed out. It is in fact the part of the reaction that's one of the major contributors to the release of energy. And you don't undo it without putting energy back in. And so the fact is that we are going to have to find ways of getting energy that are not based on burning coal, and not based on burning oil, not based on burning natural gas. And for some of those who are very concerned about the global warming issue, they are going to have to accept alternatives such as nuclear power as being a major part of the solution. And if you can get solar to be cost effective, it should be part of the mix. And if we can get anything that meets the criteria that can contribute to the solution, it ought to be part of the mix. The fact is that we have to stop excluding solutions and including solutions. I think there's a greater sense now of what ought to be done over the long term. There may not be yet the coalitions put together to deal with the problem, but I think that's coming along too. The second half of your question was how we're going to deal with dictators, and you mentioned a few of them. I think the President has made it clear that he is concerned about democracy around the world, that what he has done in 2 major steps in the Western Hemisphere have been geared to producing free and honest and fair elections. We hope that the election that was annulled in Panama can, by the pressure of the Western Hemisphere countries, be reversed. And we hope that in February, when the scheduled election in Nicaragua takes place, that it will be a free and fair election. But one thing the President has done, he has taken actions, and he has said if things don't work out correctly, then he will have to take additional actions. But he has also been wise enough not to identify what his next steps are. I think the firmness he has shown is defined clearly that he is willing to take action, but I think he's also been clever enough not to tip his hand, and I think you're just going to have to be patient and deal with these problems one at a time, not as problems occur, but in a sense as the opportunities for encouraging movement in the right direction occur.
Governor Sununu, could you comment on some of the lessons learned from the Tower nomination in light of timing, mistakes, and maybe some responsibility for the failure?
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Tower nomination is I did learn one lesson, and that is that in 6 years as governor, I only had 4 or 5 legislators ever tell me they were going to vote one way and vote another, and then found out in Washington that you have to identify where the commas, semicolons, inflections are, because sometimes what you think is a commitment is not a commitment. That was the biggest lesson I learned. I also learned that that even in nominations, partisan politics will be played.
Yes, Mr. Sununu, President Bush recently met with Alan Bosak and Bishop Desmond Tutu.
Yes, I think yesterday, 7:45. It was an early meeting.
Very good. Do you foresee a change in terms of U.S. policy towards South Africa that will induce the South African government to end apartheid within our lifetime?
Yeah, it was a good meeting. It was a meeting in which I think both Bishop Tutu and the President were very pleased at the discussions that took place. The President made it clear that we are absolutely opposed to apartheid. And I think what they essentially did was agree to keep in touch and recognize that there are opportunities coming forward. And it was very interesting in that the Bishop encouraged the President to continue discussions with the government in South Africa, recognizing that although their practices are terrible, that U.S. pressure could make a difference. And I thought the interesting part of the meeting is that not once on either part did anyone bring the issue of sanctions forward, and that there is some recognition, I think, implicit in that government-to-government pressure of other kinds might be able to produce results in a faster time frame. So I don't know of exactly what will follow from this, but I can tell you the climate was good, the willingness to continue working together was excellent, and some of the suggestions will be undertaken by Secretary of State Baker and other members of the diplomatic team in response to the suggestions they got.
For some reason here in Massachusetts, whenever the word nuclear is mentioned, our governor and federal congressmen and senators seem to go a little spastic. And my question is, do you foresee any shortages in power here in New England, that is electric power? And what should our policy planning be, both short and long term, specifically regarding fission nuclear power?
Well, it's a Northeast problem, first of all. There's no reason to believe this summer will be less tight than last summer. And especially with economic growth, you will probably be using 3%, 4% more power than you did last summer. You have not added any capacity since last summer. The interesting thing about electric delivery systems is that they don't fall off in a tapered way. They kind of fall off the table. May not happen this summer, may not happen next summer, but one of these days you will identify the fact that you have crossed over the limit. It's very interesting. There are some alternative sources that are not in the nuclear category that New England can turn to. I don't think you'll see New England turn heavily to the burning of coal. We are very sensitive to the acid rain issue. I hope we get more sensitive to the global warming issue. We might be able to get some additional power from Canada, although there are some suggestions that maybe what people thought would be available may not be available, particularly because they've had a good growth rate. But the interesting thing about that assumption is that Connecticut has a little excess power. Rhode Island has the capacity to put in a little bit of a gas-fired system to take care of their relatively smaller needs as compared to Massachusetts. Maine can go to Canada and get power. Vermont can go to Canada and get power. New Hampshire can go to Canada and get power. And that only leaves one New England state without access to anything.
Just three more, Governor. We start with the lady here.
Just to follow up, and I suppose if it was up to you, you would keep it that way too, Governor. But anyway, on an unrelated matter, first of all, I do have to lead in, notwithstanding my flippant comment. Some of us Massachusetts Democrats are also very temperate. So the question I ask comes from someone who has a great deal of respect for temperance and moderation. I don't think it's simply an inside the Beltway phenomenon. I'm curious about your response to the criticism of the perception. I understand about the artificiality of the 100-day deadline. Going back to some of your initial comments about the time that we needed to build a foundation and develop coalitions and build alliances, there's been criticism that that argument works perhaps when one has a changing in the party, but it's a little harder to make that argument when you're talking about someone who has just spent 8 years in a Republican administration and ran, I think, a campaign that some would say was built on the basis of, you know, it's not a change, it's essentially a continuation. Granted, there is room for change, and that's why, thankfully, we do have someone like a George Bush. However, that there was really a sense of continuity, and I would assume that George Bush was in large, President Bush was in large part selling to people the concept that he was the person who had a great deal of that foundation in place. And he did have some of those coalitions built. And we should feel so much safer that way. So I guess I'm curious about how one can sort of wrap oneself in the temperance in some cases and yet sell a different product.
It's because there's a difference between changing direction and broadening the path. This was not a change in direction, but it is a broadening of the path. The broadening of the path is taking place in terms of foreign policy that is taking advantage of opportunities that are there. And I think what you have seen as a beginning in Central America reflects that. There is a broadening of the path taking advantage of major transitions that are going on around the world. The China of today is not the China of yesterday. And I don't mean that in any kind of a literal sense. I mean that we are dealing with a government over there that is in itself having to cope with major change, and we will then have to have a policy that reflects that. You see a Soviet Union in which they've had elections, and I assume they were relatively fair elections. At least 2 or 3 of the unopposed candidates lost, and that's usually a reflection of a fair count. But in order to deal with those changes, you don't run out and throw initiatives on the table. You assess the reflection of those changes within the Soviet Union, and then you come forward with a suggestion that is complementary to what has taken place there. You assess what has happened in China. For example, you have something taking place in China. There's a very critical situation in the Far East. Cambodia. We have a policy in Cambodia that, surprisingly enough, supports the Chinese perspective there. We both support the return of Sihanouk to power. The question is whether or not major changes in China will add or subtract from that. And as China goes through these machinations, it influences its relationships with India. And India has relationships with Pakistan, and Pakistan with Afghanistan, and Afghanistan with Iraq and the Soviet Union. And if you're going to do something dealing with each of the pieces of the problem I've just identified, problem and opportunity, you ought to do it in a very comprehensive way. And you don't just take the solutions and the policies that were appropriate in January of 1988 or even in December of 1988, but you take the time to craft a set of policies that are reflective of what is good in mid-1989 so that you can prepare to move into 1990 and then 2000.
Reacting? I mean, isn't really what we're getting at that you're talking about a reactive?
We'll give you
I know.
one supplementary because there are
I'm sorry.
two other questions.
No, you are confusing time delay with reaction. It is not reaction when what was done in Nicaragua in dealing with the resistance fighters was to find a formula that kept the resistance together, unified Congress, and gave us a way of putting pressure on Managua to move towards elections. Managua was talking elections. It now knows it must have elections. That's not reaction. It then took that and recognized the opportunity of the election cycle in Panama and created in the framework that was the 3 and 4 weeks before the election, the personal phone calls and the personal diplomacy that created the Western Hemisphere coalition that was ready and immediately did criticize the stealing of the election by Noriega. That wasn't reaction. That was preparation for an event that was known to come and establishing the groundwork for a major sea change in relationship between ourselves and our Western Hemisphere allies. It is knowing that there is a NATO conference coming up, and yes, there may be some meddling with that conference by what Mr. Gorbachev has been trying to do. But the fact is that when you move towards that conference, you know that it's taking place then, and you are not going to preempt what you are going to do then by just fooling around 2, 3, and 4 weeks earlier. I think you are confusing the clock with reaction.
Governor, your scientific colleague, Professor Branson.
Yes.
Governor, last October 25th, candidate Bush made a singularly important speech and put out a policy statement saying that he would establish his science advisor and the director of OSTP as an assistant to the president, and he went further to describe how important this office was. And many of us scientists were very, very pleased with that, and indeed very pleased at Alan Bromley's selection. Also pleased that the president chose as his chief of staff a PhD engineer from the school down the river who has shown excellent technical judgment. One example I will give is that you had the good sense to cancel an appointment for a solicitation of $25 million of unpeer-reviewed money for cold fusion. I'd like to ask you, if you would, to just give us the sort of 2 or 3 principal issues that you think ought to occupy priority interest for Dr. Bromley when he comes on board.
My staff swears that the cancellation of the appointment was the result of an experiment we did in the wastebasket, but I deny that. I talked to Alan yesterday and outlined, what he would like to do. There's a couple of things that I think are very basic, not very exciting, but very important, and they will be done first. And that is to gather together the network of the principal science and technology positions within other departments of government. And frankly, believe it or not, they have not had a formal or informal meeting process in place. And Alan and I have agreed that whether he does it with a breakfast once a month or something like that, there's about 2 to 3 dozen key positions that ought to be talking to each other on a regular basis. Not very sexy, but I think you'll understand how critical that is. Second thing is to reestablish an advisory council. We went over about a dozen names yesterday, and they'll probably be announced within a few weeks. The process of checking is one of the most frustrating things I've had to deal with, but they will be announced within a few weeks. Broad, various engineering science disciplines, a couple from the social sciences, which in itself will be unusual, but a recognition that an advisory council to the president has to be first class in quality and be able to meet with the president. And we have put together a group that is designed to, and the president's wish is that they have access to him, and they will. Those are the first two things that will be done. Now, in terms of issues, there's a recognition that industrial science and technology policy is a key component that has been neglected in science advisory roles in the past. Alan wants to name a deputy to focus on that area. And without stealing all of his thunder when he announces his organization, let me tell you that he's identified 2 or 3 other areas that will be elevated to deputy positions with some key people brought in to focus on those, and they too will be part of the very visible, very active advisory process. One last point. I am very concerned about, again, a fundamental issue, and our research and development structures, both in public and private institutions, with a quality level of individual, we're going to lose out, and the better people are choosing not to go on. That, to me, is one of the unseen but critical issues that I've asked Alan and others to address.
This has to be our last question. I leave this gentleman for waiting even longer than this gentleman.
Yes.
If we take them both, we can. We'll do
so
both quickly. I'll make it a short answer.
A lot of countries around the world are looking to the United States for the lead in Southeast Asian foreign policy. You mentioned earlier the policy toward Cambodia. Can you quickly comment on what the administration is thinking about the repatriation of Vietnamese refugees, and also whether or not the human rights abuses of Hanoi is going to enter into the calculus for normalization with that regime?
Yeah, I can't give you the answer, but I can tell you that the Secretary of State has a group of people that are trying to evaluate what if you will, a review of the policy and whether or not a major change should take place. But I don't have an answer as to what it's going to be yet.
Or toward the normalization issue?
I honestly can't tell you what the issue in terms of the human rights is part of it. The issue in terms of what our policy on immigration will be. The issue in terms of what our relationship with other countries that have accepted great numbers of refugees and are now, in a sense, had their resources strained. Will we provide either assistance or refugee admission? These are all questions that are being examined. And I can't tell you where they're going to come out because I just haven't talked to anybody since they started.
And this really has to be the last one, Governor.
Yeah, I'll just make it real quick. In reference to the Middle East, could you say that recent events of the past 2 years have basically given the sides involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict, including the United States, such an understanding of the parameters of the conflict and the necessary requirements for peace that future details really won't affect people's thinking to a great extent because they already understand what needs to be done?
I'm not sure I understand it, but let me say that what I think has happened in the last 2 years is a creation of an environment and set of relationships that is beginning to make it advantageous for the critical parties over there to come to solution. And I think in the past there has been an environment in which, at least for one of the parties, the optimal decision was to do nothing. And what you have had now is a change in climate where, believe it or not, both parties are now saying something has to be done. Once they acknowledge something has to be done, then they begin to work on what the something is. And I think that's the best news of what's occurred. Thank you very much.
Can I thank the Governor not only for an extraordinarily comprehensive speech, but also for the very frank and very fair way in which he's answered a very large range of questions. We're very grateful to you, Governor, and don't forget you're invited again in a year's time.